Oh God, what we pray this morning is in a host of things that are taking place in and outside of this room. We're mindful of those. As a people of prayer, we constantly want to bring them before you as an act of faith and trust in you. At the same time, an act of belief that you have an ability to break into our time and space and to bring about change in different ways and formats. And so we want to be mindful of that. At the same time, if in the next hour and a half, we could also keep those at bay so that we can focus in on this time of study. What we hope is reflective learning, which means that we want it to not just be what we learn about the text, but we want the text to be applied to our life, or actually what we want is for you to use the text to leverage it in a way that brings about change inside of us from the inside out, so that our nature, our identity, our thoughts, our actions reflect the nature of Christ. And so we want to be open to how your Spirit can use this time, use the study, use the conversation, use our thinking to bring about the gospel living inside of us. And we pray this in the name of Christ. Amen. All right, so John last week was, he walked us through chapter 2, verses 1 through 11. Hopefully that's what we did, right? Yeah. So just a little bit of a recap, just to get us back on the same page and to kind of set the stage for to begin at verse 12. Chapter 1, keep in mind, all right, Paul is writing to some house churches in Rome that is predominantly Greek or predominantly Gentile. It does have Jewish Christians as a part of it, but they're the minority. And Paul does not have a relationship with them, so he wants to establish a relationship via first writing. He wants to change their behavior to some degree, which is how they interact with each other. And at the same time, he wants to set stage for one day he hopes to visit them. So that's the overarching purpose of the book. The major part of chapter 1 deals with Paul is addressing through what God has done for people, all people, but specifically for those outside of the covenant. Now, when I talk about outside the covenant, in this particular, specifically what I'm talking about is those outside of the covenant of the Old Testament. So we're talking about Gentiles. Sometimes they're some of your versions might say Greek, some of your versions might even say pagans. And the idea is those outside of faith. God has revealed Himself in what we call natural revelation, which means is that even though someone is not part of Old Testament covenant, they still are without excuse, because in some form or fashion, to whatever level, God has revealed Himself through just what people process from seeing creation. For instance, those that go to the mountains, and you go to the mountains and you ask the big questions because you see the beauty of it. Those who go to the beach, or something that you see in the world, and it can be with creation as in things or with people. And from that, there's levels of questions or thoughts about something larger than just what you see. That's what we mean by natural revelation. That there are elements or there are aspects of revelation that show up inside of the natural world. All right? So chapter 1, Paul is addressing that God has revealed in some way to people what we call natural revelation, in hopes that it would draw them closer to Him. But what has happened is that some have resisted that. And what the text says in chapter 1 is that they did not give thanks to God, nor did they worship Him. And so then the result is that they receive in what Romans calls wrath. Now, wrath is not wrath as in here comes lightning and fire, and what wrath in chapter 1 is people then live into whatever their desires are without indication of God's influence on them. No different when if you have children or grandchildren, and children, you say, look, this is the best thing for you. I need you to do X. They do Y. And wrath can be, where you hands-on punish, or it could be, okay, I'm going to let you live into the consequences of your decision. Chapter 1 is living into the consequences of their decisions. Now, when we get to chapter 2, the conversation changes now not to those outside of the Old Testament covenant, but to people inside of the Old Testament covenant. And so he's going to be addressing Jews, Jewish Christians, Jews, and anybody that would be inside of Old Testament covenant. And the chapter itself follows where the idea is whether you're inside the Old Testament covenant, or whether you start outside of the covenant, or you start inside the covenant, what he's drawing us to is in chapter 3, he's setting an argument so that in chapter 3, both sides, inside the covenant or outside the covenant, are at the same place. They're both in need of grace. Because they're all going to be guilty of sin. In chapter 1, he's talking about those outside the covenant. In chapter 2, he's going to deal with people inside the covenant. And so what Paul is doing is laying out this argument in chapter 2, the reason why people inside the Old Testament covenant still need Jesus Christ, because they are guilty of violating the demands or the aspects or the requirements of the covenant. What y'all looked at last week, hopefully, was in 1 verses 1 through 11, is that the people inside the covenant have they stand in judgment of those outside the covenant, and so there's issues around judging other people and being guilty of violating their own sense of judgment. For instance, what we would call that is hypocrisy. The idea that would say, they're all the bad people, we're not the bad people, because we have the Old Testament covenant, but yet they do the same thing that those outside the covenant, they do the same thing. So he's setting this argument with basically a fictitious Jewish teacher. He's having this imaginary argument with someone like a Jewish teacher or Jewish rabbi, saying, you stand in judgment and say, woe is them, they're guilty, they're not inside the covenant, so they're in trouble, and yet the same qualifications that you expect them to be faithful to, you're not faithful to. Does that make sense? We're all on the same page? All right. So he's he's arguing that Israel is not fulfilling their covenant, the covenant mandate to be the purpose of what Israel was supposed to be in the Old Testament, which was to be a light to the nations, to draw people to God. And so he's having this conversation with this imaginary Jewish teacher or character who believes in their own superiority over being inside the covenant compared to those who are outside the covenant. All right, does that make sense? All right, so we're hopefully we're all on the same page there. And really the issue in the first 11 verses has a lot to do with hypocrisy and the struggles, and that's a temptation that's not just for people inside of the Old Testament covenant. That is a temptation for anybody who walks with God. And it plays out all throughout the world. And I mean, one of the themes that show up throughout all of church history is those that consider themselves insiders have the temptation is because we are insider, then we have an elevated status with God over those that are outside. So you see yourself in an elevated state, but you don't hold yourself accountable to that elevated state, which then results in hypocrisy. All right? And so even though he's talking about specifically those inside the Old Testament covenant, this is something that we probably need to think about even in our own day and time. Because I'm a Christian. You might not be a Christian. I'm pretending, okay? So it's going to work out good for me. It's not going to work out good for you. But good luck to that. Sometimes I'd even go so far as to say it's not my responsibility to reach out to those who are outside the covenant because I'm inside the covenant. All right, so it's a temptation that sits with all of us, and it can be. It has plagued the church universal throughout the churches throughout her history. So now when we get to verse 12, again inside of this whole theme of Paul is addressing those who have this sense of superiority of being inside the Old Testament covenant. What he's doing is he's going to pick apart where this inflated sense of identity, and he's going to put that under the microscope of what are you really doing with it. Now, one of the things we talked about early on, but going back to chapter 1, is that God is the determining factor in what is considered enough for people. In chapter 1, there's revelation that's given to people who are outside the covenant, and which is going to look different than those inside the covenant. And so one of the questions that we asked back then is that, well, is that fair? Those outside the covenant, are they held to a different standard than those inside the covenant? And it's a yes and a no answer. But the yes part of that answer is, it is different. I mean, there are certain responsibilities that come with levels of revelation that you have received. You don't treat a 2-year-old and a 20-year-old the same. Why? I mean, why? That's exactly right. The answer is because they don't understand the same thing. They're held to a different level of accountability. Now, when a 20-year-old acts like a 2-year-old, the levels of repercussions or punishment that comes with that are more severe. And the reason why is because there's more expected out of them. They should, all right? But that has as an undercurrent or a prerequisite the idea that they know more because they have received more, which means then that the responsibility that comes with that is more. And so you get the same thing here. And what he's going to do over the rest of this chapter is he's going to put under the microscope where this idea of superiority comes from, and it's going to revolve around Torah, it's going to revolve around election, and it's going to revolve around circumcision. And he's going to identify all of them and really sort of analyze what they really mean and then what's required of them. Because those that are inside the covenant have misused those. All right? Does that make sense? So that's sort of where we're going, just so that we'll have a better idea of what the whole chapter is going to be like. So let's look at this. So if somebody would read verses 12 through 16. All right?
All who sin apart from the law will also perish apart from the law. And all who sin under the law will be judged by the law. For it is not those who hear the law righteous in God's sight, but it is those who obey the law who will be declared righteous. Indeed, when Gentiles who do not have the law do by nature things required by the law, they are a law for themselves, even though they do not have the law. Since they show that the requirements of the law are written on their hearts, their consciences also bearing witness, and their thoughts now accusing, now even defending them. This will take place on the day when God will judge men's secrets through Jesus Christ. That's my gospel declares.
All right. So what we have here is, again, he's laying out the different people. And in this case, it's either Greeks or it's Jews. Those outside the covenant, those inside the covenant. And what he's addressing is that, now when he talks about the law in the Old Testament, that's the Torah. All right, so just going forward, the Old Testament are divided for both, for Jews and for Christians. When you think about the Old Testament, thematically, you think about it in two major theological terms. You think about law and you think about prophets. Jesus, when he gives summary of that in the Gospels, the law and the prophets. Transfiguration, who's there? Go. All right, you got Elijah. There's two people. Moses and Elijah. All right. And this is when Jesus up on the mountain with the inner three disciples. He's transfigured inside of their presence. And what Peter, James, and John see is Jesus. And then they see on one side Moses and on one side Elijah. What does Moses represent? The law. Exactly right. And Elijah represents the chief or the chief of the prophets. He's not the only one, but he summarizes the whole of all the prophets. And so what you have is in the Old Testament is just theologically you have law and then you have prophets. And the law is condensed in the Torah. Now, often when we think about the law, we think of 10 Commandments. But when you read the Torah, which is Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, those 5 books represent the law of the Old Testament. I mean, it's not just Exodus when you get the 10 Commandments. The 10 Commandments show up in Leviticus. The 10 Commandments show up in Deuteronomy. And they come out of being connected to a covenant that starts with Abraham. All right, so you see in the first 5 books of the Old Testament this idea of covenant being made with Abraham, then Abraham's descendants, and eventually goes down into Egypt, and then out of Egypt in Passover and the book of Exodus, and then possess the land, and they live into that a certain way. And that certain way is described and defined by the law. And so then you get into the historical parts of the Old Testament, which is nothing more than what it's like to live that way. Well, when they start running afoul, guess who comes in to put them back on course? Who? The prophets, right. So you got all the Old Testament. So now you can pass an Old Testament survey course. Not a problem. You just collect the course, you're good to go, right? So, but this is what you have. So in the Old Testament, one of the negative consequences that come out of this is that in the Old Testament there's a sense of elevated self because they have the Torah and nobody else does. Now, the Torah was given to help the people inside the covenant to be and to live a certain way so that all the other nations around them would see that and then be directed to God. Now what you have is, no, we got it, you don't. Good luck. That's slang terms for what happened in the Old Testament. And so he's identifying what took place in the Old Testament for those who are under the covenant and what was supposed to happen, but what didn't happen. And on top of that, what do you do with people who are outside of the covenant but actually live like they're inside of the covenant? That's what we got in the very beginning, right? Verse 12. All who have sinned apart from the law will also perish apart from the law. All right, so he's talking about those Greeks. But all who have sinned under the law will be judged by the law. Now he's talking about those inside the covenant. For it is not the hearers of the law who are righteous in God's sight, but the doers of the law, which means that he's identifying that there are people inside the covenant who have received the law, the Torah, but do not do the Torah. And so now the Torah is their judge. All right, you got looks of confusion. Is that we good, bad, indifferent? Where are we at? We got it? All right. So no different than when you say the rules of living in the greenhouse are these. And you lay them out. And when Connor or Caroline or Shane or Brooke violate one of the rules, then the rules are now their judge, right? And so same thing's what he's doing with the Old Testament. But you've got, with the people who are inside the Old Testament covenant. But you have some people who are outside of the Torah, or outside, they did not receive the Torah or the law, but yet they're more faithful to it than those that received it. That's what Paul is identifying here. And what he's laying out to these folks is that the law that you have received that's the plumb line for you. If you are doers of that law, well done. But if just because you have received the law, but you don't practice the law, how is that any better than someone who doesn't receive the law, but yet does the law? So he's identifying the different folks. So judgment will be according to what levels of revelation one has received. And for these who are part of this Old Testament covenant, who's received the Torah, how faithful they have been to the law determines where they're at. And in this case, they have not been faithful. They've not been obedient. And so for those who say, you know what, I belong to God. And yet there's no doing of that, there's no fruit of that. How is that any different from someone who says, well, I don't really know who God is, but they live out what it's like to be a Christian?
You judged on what you know.
Bingo. And what you do. Knowing and doing are tied to the same here, okay? So, it's not, faith is not just a cognitive belief or just an action in the New Testament. Faith are both of those. And the idea that we live in a time, and this you can go back probably to the mid-1800s, the mid-1900s, the mid-1800s, 19th century, that Western Christian thought got in a habit of separating what you believe cognitively and what you do, how you function with your actions. And that's really an unfortunate thing. Now, the idea was heavy push in evangelism to get people to believe theologically orthodoxy. Remember what orthodoxy is? Right belief. And so the idea was, we need to preach people believing, understanding, living with this level of worldview. Keep in mind, you're living then in a post-enlightenment period. So I know you got to go back and dust off that European history that you love so much. So the idea of belief thinking becomes a big deal. That's what the Enlightenment, that's what the Enlightenment pushed. How you think. I think, therefore what? Right. So naturally, the church lives inside of that. So it preaches about our thought. Well, we use the word faith, believe. So if you can believe in a God, believe with a Judeo-Christian worldview, that was the first steps into becoming a Christian, right? So what happened, the negative aspect of that and consequence was that faith then was solely left in the camp of thinking, not so much doing. But in the New Testament, you cannot parse it that way. In the New Testament, it's thinking and doing it at the same time. And but would you have people who've not been given the Torah, but yet they're more faithful to the law than those who've been given the law but yet aren't faithful to it. And so you have in this part of this text where Paul is picking apart this belief that says, well, I'm an insider because I have all these things that have been given to me, and yet it does not play out into a way of life. Where's the evidence that says I've been given this? I mean, if I'm no different than the average, then or than people who haven't received it, how can I stand and defend myself against the Torah when you cannot see any evidences of the Torah in my life? Is it because I carry around a little 10 Commandments scroll in my pocket? And whenever someone asks me what I'm about, I bring out my scroll and I say, there I am. Okay, how's that any different than someone who doesn't have the scroll, but yeah, they're faithful to the 10 Commandments? Actually, Paul would say the ones that are faithful to the 10 Commandments are in a better place than those who are not faithful, and yet they've received all this stuff. So he's really putting this thought of, for those who are insiders, who have been given the covenant and yet haven't been faithful, there's really not a way that people inside can stand up and say, well, it's going to be easy for me. Again, now that could be a temptation that we have as well. So he's not just talking about, Old Testament. Even though he's using Old Testament words and these Old Testament concepts, what's the hymn say? How are they to know that we are Christians? By our love. Thank you. So what if we're unloving? Not going to know that we're Christians, right? Do we just say, well, I'm a member of St. Paul? That works for a little bit. I mean, it's a good church. I mean, so he's got some, innocence by association, but at some point, who we are is the determining factor. And in the New Testament, who we are is not just our thoughts, but it's what we do. Those are tied together. So you can see that he's talking to insiders. All right. Any comments or things that are still unclear about this particular portion? Sure.
So in the first verse we read, number 12,
Mm-hmm.
for all who have sinned without the law will perish without the law. I'm assuming that means those who've not heard it.
That's right. He's talking about, that's the people outside the covenant.
So, but they will perish without the law. So explain to me what that
All right. They will be held accountable to the levels of revelation they have received, which is going to be
through the nature of God that's
through natural revelation. Yeah, exactly right. Mm-hmm. And so a good example would be, what about the person who never hears the gospel in a very specific way, compared to so they're even though they haven't heard the gospel in a very specific way, there still has been revelation that's been given or revealed to them by God through natural revelation. They will be held accountable to that. But those who have been given specific revelation, and in this case the law and the Torah, they're going to be held accountable to what they have received. Is that clear?
So in other words, what you're saying is a person or a tribe, you could say, of people that live somewhere in Africa,
Mhm.
and have never seen a missionary, never heard
Mhm.
anything about God. They have seen butterflies and birds fly. They got to know something is bigger. So that's how God would just say, these people don't know anything, so they're out of here.
Right. Well, a good example would be Abraham. Did Abraham hear specifically about Jesus?
No.
Right. So how in the world can Abraham be accountable to the way, the truth, and the law? He can't be held to the same level that Peter was. He just did not witness what. Yeah. The comment was he had a child when he was 100. Yeah, I couldn't even fathom. I couldn't have a child at 46. I mean, so much less 100. One of the things we mentioned a couple of weeks ago, and I think it's important to talk about, if you can imagine a funnel, all right? At somewhere at the bottom of the funnel, Jesus Christ. Take your example of someone who lives out, never heard of the gospel, what have you, but maybe they've been exposed to the larger concept of spirituality. All right, so maybe that's how God has revealed Himself to that specific person in hopes that it would lead them towards maybe other questions, maybe a journey of what it means, that maybe there is this idea of one who is behind it all. All right? Even though they haven't seen specific revelation in Jesus Christ, that we don't know what God is doing behind the scenes throughout time and space to bring eventually to that. All right? Now, one of the questions that we also would ask about this text is, all right, so if those that have been given the Torah, and yet just because they've received the Torah, they haven't been obedient to the Torah, does that mean they're out? Well, we'll address that in chapters 9, 10, and 11. Does that make sense? So the other side of the coin is, what about these that started here? And they said no. Is the game over for them? And, in 9, 10, and 11, what you discover is, no, it's not. Now, we're not at 9, 10, or 11, so, just kind of hold on to that. But you can just put a peg inside of your mind. Because behind this is not, go back to chapter 1. The first movement of God is not wrath. Wrath doesn't show up until, it shows up a little bit in 18. All right? But when you look at 16, 17, this is about the gospel of Jesus Christ that's been revealed. But the first movement of God inside of 18 through 25 is not wrath. It's first that God has revealed Himself. And there hasn't been gratitude nor worship. So, one of the things that we like, for those that might be who've received specific revelation, is we like to be the ones now who stand in judgment. I know. Let me tell you what to do. But what we have all throughout this is God revealing Himself first in aspects of grace. Now, the other side of grace is that if God reveals, to use New Testament language, a kingdom to live in, what happens? The question then is asked, what happens for those who are outside the kingdom? Well, they're not living inside the kingdom. The kingdom has its own way of life. Outside the kingdom has its own way of life as well. The book of Revelation sets up in picture, with image, and two kingdoms. One that is ruled by God, one that is not. And the one that is not ruled by God devours itself. That's what the book of Revelation is about. And as much as that kingdom wants to invade, violate, push over into God's kingdom, God doesn't allow it. But yet God at any moment can touch the center of that kingdom that's not ruled by Him. That's the imagery of Revelation. It has all this Old Testament, and people get all, we've actually archived our teachings on Revelation. So if you want to go back, you can always look at it. But the thumbnail sketch of Revelation is that God reveals Himself all the time. And God's first step is never wrath.
It's calling you.
It's always grace. Yeah, calling is the wooing. In the New Testament, whenever you see called, and Paul uses it all the time, that's the wooing. And the wooing takes place for those who start first with the law, and for those who are outside the law. It's still the wooing to Him. And that never goes away. You can never get away from the calling of God. The prodigal son.
Well, there's a whole world that lives outside of our Western
Sure.
churches,
Mhm.
Sunday school, that still see God and love God. Like in the Old Testament, they called the God-fearers.
That's right.
They were people that
Sure.
at first loved the
Yeah,
idea
what
of God.
What she is talking about is that there are people who are outside the covenant in both the Old Testament and the New Testament who were called God-fearers. There are people who are non-Jews, but yet they want to live with an understanding of who God is and allow that to be a part of their life. Cornelius in the New Testament, he's a prime example of it. So what happens? Cornelius starts way out here. And he's a God-fearer, which means he orients his life in thought and deed around what it's like to follow this God. And so he directs his life that way. He starts moving toward. Now, through an act of the Holy Spirit, who visits Cornelius? Peter, that's right. So I know we're in the New Testament, so that's okay. So Peter comes to Cornelius. He visits his house one day, not just Cornelius, but all of his household. And he starts to see things in Cornelius' life that looks like his own life. And so then what does he do? Is there anybody, I see now that you are moving, God is moving in your life, and they pray for the Holy Spirit to come. And the same thing that took place in Pentecost in Acts chapter 2 takes place again where you have this Gentile Pentecost. I mean, there's actually two Pentecosts in the book of Acts. You have one that's the original or the first Pentecost, and then you have another one that comes to Cornelius' house. First one to Jews in the upper room, second one to Gentiles. But the same side effects and evidences of Acts chapter 2 show up in Acts chapter 10. Well, what's that? What do we make of that? Well, maybe God's first actions and steps are always to want to bring people to Himself. And wrath is not His first movement. I mean, that's just a consequence of a constant rejection of the grace that He offers. But for those who are inside, we like Jonah. You remember the story of Jonah? Go and preach to those outside the covenant. Number one, I don't want to do it. And number two, when I do it, I definitely don't want them to repent. And I want the front row seat of watching burning. That's what Paul is turning on its head right now. And he said, just because people are inside, that you've received specific revelation, be thankful that you've received that, but at the same time, know what comes with that. You're held accountable to what you've received. And those inside the covenant are held accountable to what they've received. Just like those outside the covenant are held accountable as well. All right? Good? How about a break? All right, let's take about 10 minutes for break. Right.
And so I was going to, I sent a whole.
Good deal. All right. Thank you. All right. So let's jump back in with verse 17. We're going to look at the next leg of Paul's argument. If someone would read for us verses 17 through 24.
You are instructed from the law. And if you are sure that you yourself are a guide to the blind, a light to those embodiment of knowledge and truth, others, do you not teach yourself? While you preach against stealing, do you steal? You who say that one must not commit adultery, do you commit adultery? You who abhor idols, do you rob temples? You who boast in the law, dishonor God by breaking the law. Blaspheme among the Gentiles because of you.
All right. Well, thank you. So now, and again, we pick up on those inside the covenant received the Torah, which led to a thought in Old Testament, and the majority of Old Testament it plays this out, is this idea of a place of privilege because of what they have received or because of election. And that Paul now is addressing that with some of the things that we talked about before the break, that you have received this and have drawn a conclusion of place of importance, but yet you violate every aspect of what you have received. And so again, this idea of hypocrisy comes back to the forefront. Now what he's addressing is, again, this fictitious debater or instructor, and it's not an actual person in the church. This is just a way of making his argument. And and he's dealing with the three pillars inside of ancient Judaism. This idea of monotheistic or monotheism, the idea of election, the idea of receiving the Torah. And the Torah was meant to be a beacon of a way of life to a world that didn't practice that way. And yet what actually was processed out was, because we received the Torah, we're at a highlighted position compared to everyone else. So now Paul's being a little, you got a little bit of hyperbole going on inside the text, and where he's bringing out certain issues that they might or might not have violated. And you see that in that list of things. You get the idea of what Torah specific revelation was supposed to yield or was supposed to bring people to. And you see this in verse 19, that you would be a guide to the blind, a light to those who are in darkness, a corrector of the foolish, a teacher of children, having the law, the embodiment of knowledge and of truth. So you have what was supposed to happen in those verses leading up to verse 21. But what you find in verse 21 is 21 through that little bit that we looked at. You have what actually happened, or in this hyperbole of how they violated what they have received. Do you forbid one thing, in this case adultery, and yet you commit it? Do you abhor idols, and yet you rob temples? Do you boast in the law, and yet you dishonor God? So, he's not necessarily trying to say they've done these specific things. What he's bringing to their attention is that all these things that are outlined in the Torah that you think justifies you, and yet you do the opposite, how are you not any better than the rest of us? If that makes sense. So I don't want you to sort of zero in specifically on that he's talking about, only about adultery, only about, robbing temples compared to worshiping idols. The real thought is in verse 23. You boast in something and yet you dishonor the God that actually gives you what you're boasting in. If that makes sense. The root of hypocrisy is in a smug sense of superiority based on a self-assured person. And often that can become the sticks by which those types of persons beat up on someone else. Now Jesus picks up this same, so just that you know that it's not just something in the Old Testament and something in Paul. Jesus in the Gospels picks up this same thought in Matthew chapter 7, verses 3 through 5, where you have this conversation with Jesus about removing the plank in your own eye before you're worrying about a speck in someone else's eye. One of the major causes to atheism, and really maybe not so much atheism, but agnosticism, is Christians who will acknowledge Jesus with their lips, but yet when they walk out of the door, their lives deny Him. I mean, that has been true throughout the ages. If they acknowledge Jesus with their lips, but their lives deny Him. No different than when Jesus is talking to the Pharisees in the New Testament. You who are supposed to be the teachers of all those that have received this specific revelation, and yet your life is like a whitewashed tomb. That's actually what he says. So I mean, when you read the Gospels, just be careful. What Paul is getting at here about of people are held accountable to the level of revelation they have received. In the Gospels, what you find for people who have not received much, Jesus is incredibly gracious. The people on the fringes, the sinners, the prostitutes, the tax collectors. I mean, there's a laundry list that shows up all throughout the Gospels. Yet for those who should know and yet don't do, that is the harshest language in the Gospels are reserved for those. I mean, so that's something we need to pay attention to. We would be the ones who have received specific revelation. And so you have it, this is a consistent theme all throughout the Bible. It's not just something Paul is just addressing because it only applies here to the Roman church. Paul is picking up the issue that is here in the Roman church, but the greater theme of this is all throughout the Bible. Now, I would argue if you study the church's history, you see it all throughout the church's history. This is a consistent message here. And it's something that all of us should pay attention to. But he's zeroing in on those who have received this Torah, which in their mind led to an elevated sense of self in connection to God, and yet glad to take the privilege that comes with that, but not really willing to embrace the parts of the covenants that required a different way of life. You can't have one without the other. Maybe that's a better way of saying it. We like to say grace is free, and you hear sermons about all of God's grace is free, and the idea is that you can't merit it, you can't pay for it, you don't deserve it. But the idea that there's nothing that is required of grace, you can't make that case. There's a whole way of life. Christianity or Judeo-Christian way of life comes with a pretty clear level of ethics. And it's not for the faint of heart. You're asked to love. You're asked to forgive. You're asked to sacrifice. You're asked to do so many. No, let me take it back. You're not asked. You're commanded. We're all commanded to be this type of person that is based off the life of Jesus. And now we get aid and help, the life of the Spirit living inside of us. But the requirements of the covenant, that never changes. Because a covenant way of life is to be a life preserver to a world that left unto themselves will devour each other, destroy themselves. And so this is a way out that God gives humanity, which means there's those that are supposed to be life preservers. I mean that has a job description with it, and to dismiss it is, but yet want the title or the status or the place of being those who have received this. You can't have one without the other. To not hold them in contention and connection is to be no different than the ones that Paul is describing in the text. All right? Kind of sobering passage, isn't it? It's not one that you have the warm fuzzies over, right? No, it should be. I mean, this is people who follow Jesus. I mean, really do want to follow Jesus and really give themselves to that. I don't mean perfection, all right? So we're not talking about being perfect, but where, like, I get the question all the time. What does it mean to be a Christian? What stuff like and I don't think it's as. I think if you really do want to love God, that's it. That's going to play out in your life, and as that plays out over time, if there is a good sense of intent and then a progression of how that plays out in your life when it comes to behavior and function, we should never fear judgment or wrath or whatever the negative side of that. It really isn't about perfection. Perfection shows up in Romans 1, 16 and 17. And by faith, you get that level of perfection. That's applied to your life. But it's not absolute perfection, which means that you're always going to get it right every single time. But saying that, just because it's not going to be right every single time, doesn't excuse us from the desire and the process of wanting to follow this Jesus. And a good rule of thumb, if you're worried about this, would be if you, the same way that you do love the people around you, okay, if that's the plumb line, if that's applied to God, I think that's enough. Does that make sense? I mean, however you see love, describe love, following of that, and giving your life to that. I mean, what else? Tell me what else God would want. I mean, He's already. What shows up in the Bible is we're not going to be like Jesus. There's not the ability to do that. Now we're striving for that, which takes in our intent, and which takes in how our intent plays out into behavior. But the idea that Jesus does these 1,000 things and He gets those right, and once we do those 1,000 things, you can forget that. 1,000 is just a made up number, all right? So, but if you authentically want to follow, that's the key there. So I know this passage talks about judgment and it's really bringing to task those that have received specific revelation. And often we can take away from this, oh gosh, woe is me. I need to go in the corner over here. That's not what this passage is about. Now, this passage is saying there are requirements that come with what you have received. But if there is intent in your heart to be loving, and you really are striving to be like Jesus, that is what's required. Does that make sense? All right, so I don't want you to walk away with all this guilt and shame and, see all the negatives, it's like, because what's easy for all of us in Western culture, Torah says this, here they are, and before we see all the things that we do, what are you going to see? All the things we don't. I mean, that's Western culture for you, okay? That's not bad, all right? But let me speak first person. I can tell you what Shane will see. First thought is, man, I didn't do that one. Oh, terrible at that, And what we do is we miss all these other things. That's like we read Genesis 1 and 2. We talk about the Garden of Eden. What do we always think about the Garden of Eden? Snake and apple. The one thing you can't do. That is perfect, all right? We did not plan this, by the way, all right? That's the one, when we read that, we think about the one thing we can't do. I mean, what was given to Adam and Eve is not the prescription, to not do that. It's, you can do whatever you want. I mean, do all kinds of things, but stay clear of just this one thing. Now, because we're, product of our culture, we think, oh, one thing, boom, there it goes, right? So, we read this passage and we think, oh, I'm no different than those inside the covenant. I just can't come to this Bible study anymore. I mean, it's bad news, it's going to be written on my forehead, so I'm going to go home and feel guilty, sit on the couch for a while. And don't do that, all right? I mean, seriously, if your intent is, I really do want to love God. I do. And, I'm going to be open, which means I'm not going to resist it, all right? I'm going to be open to how the Holy Spirit's going to be working in my life so that it really does play out in how I function and how I behave. If you can be authentic with those two things, don't worry about the other stuff. It's no different than the number one analogy in the Scriptures to describe God's relationship with humanity is that of parent-child. The second one is that of spouse. All right? So some of you have been married in here, right? Some of you have been married longer than I have, all right? So how many times have you, we'll make it easy, how many times have your spouse not done, they just, totally made you angry? Has that ever happened? All right. So, same. How many times you've done things to make them angry, right? So, I mean, but yet there still is a relationship, still is a life. All right? Parent and child. I'm sure all of our children, mine are, I don't know about y'all's, they're perfect. Right? They're not. All right? Now, I know they're not perfect. But I'll tell you, in my eyes, they're perfect.
So the reason I agree, I'm a little bit hung up on grace.
Sure.
Agree, but anyway, so based on all the good things that they've done before, that's why they get the grace when they do the bad things? Or,
all right, so
if they had never done anything good?
Yeah, let's go back to, all right, let's go back to grace being free. When we get to chapter 3, what Paul is doing, he's already talked about those outside the covenant. And he says basically they've been given some level of revelation, have not worshiped, were not, did not, no gratitude, no worship, and basically settled for idols. Something less than what God has given them. So they're in need of grace from God. In chapter 2 and in part of chapter 3, he's going to be addressing those inside the covenant, because one of the things people inside the covenant could be, we already know about chapter 1. They're a bunch of heathens. And you know what? They're going to get what they deserve. They're outside the covenant. We got the covenant. They don't have the covenant, so they're good luck to y'all. So Paul says, well, what about those inside the covenant? So you've been given the covenant, got specific revelation, which means now you're held accountable to that, and you violated the very thing that you've been given. Which means then, okay, you're in the same boat as the people over here, because both people are not perfect. So they're going to need something. All right, the way Romans 3 says it is that for all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And it actually goes on to give a commentary to that, is that on your best day, we're really nothing more than filthy rags. All right, so Paul cuts through everything for those outside the covenant or inside the covenant when we get to chapter 3. So all of us now are in need. Well, the answer to that, he goes back to Romans 1, 16 and 17, says, okay, we're all on the same boat. It's all level ground here. The good news is God has given grace in the person Jesus Christ. So, Marty, in that aspect, that is free, which means that you cannot merit it, you can't pay it, or you can't purchase it. There's nothing inside of humanity, either outside the covenant or inside the covenant, that can generate the gospel. It's something that you have received, it's been given. And in that case, it is free. If we draw the conclusion of free, meaning there's not something that's required, then it's not free. So when I was making that comparison, that grace being free, it is free, and it's not. The idea, a lot of things we take for free, we don't assign requirements with it, because if there's requirements to come with it, then it's not free, right? If I say, well, I'm going to love you, but my love is not free. My love comes with conditions. So God's grace is free in the fact that it is given, and someone can't generate it, purchase it, own it on its own. But it's not free in the sense that it's absent of requirements. All right, so that's what I meant by the play on words with freedom, or free and not free. But what we have here in 2 is, because he's already talked about those who are outside the covenant, who have received levels of revelation, they did not respond appropriately, which means they didn't worship, there was no gratitude. Now he's addressing those inside the covenant that says, you have received something very specific for a certain purpose, and yet you have violated what you have received. And so what you have received will become the measure by which you are held accountable to. And in this case, it's the Torah, the law. You have received the very law of God, and yet you weren't obedient, you did not follow the very law of God. So the law that you have received now becomes your judge. Well, at the end of this, what we're going to get is that, those that are inside the covenant, now they're in trouble, because they're in the same boat as those who are outside the covenant. So if he stopped writing at chapter 3, then we do know we need to get in the corner then, because there's no hope. But what he'll do as part of that is he goes back to what the remedy for both sides are. And that remedy is Jesus Christ. All right? Does that make sense? So let's do 25 just real quick through the end of the chapter, just so that I will feel real good about staying on point. All right? So verse 25. Circumcision indeed is of value if you obey the law, but if you break the law, your circumcision has become uncircumcision. So if those who are circumcised keep the requirements of the law, will not their uncircumcision be regarded as circumcision? Then those who are physically uncircumcised but keep the law will condemn you that have the written code of circumcision but break the law. For a person is not a Jew who is one outwardly, nor is true circumcision something external and physical. Rather, a person is a Jew who is one inwardly, and real circumcision is a matter of the heart. It is spiritual and not literal. Such a person receives praise not from others, but from God. All right, so now he's drilling in on something very specific, which was the symbol of all of this. Now keep in mind, when was circumcision first introduced to people of the covenant? Abraham. All right. So Abraham received the covenant, and a sign of covenant faithfulness for both sides was circumcision. Now, I think, for the most part, I think circumcision's practiced, at least in the United States, pretty much across the board. And so circumcision on some degree is not the same in our society as what it would be inside of the ancient, at this time in the ancient world. There were a number of cultures that did not practice circumcision. And then there were also some cultures that practiced partial circumcisions and things like that. Inside of Old Testament Jewish practices, circumcision was a sign, and it was a full circumcision, was a sign of what it meant to be a part of this covenant that was given to Abraham. First it was Abraham, and then it was his descendants, right? So the symbol of the covenant was circumcision. But circumcision in and of itself was nothing more than just a physical symbol. Correct? So just having the physical symbol, does that make you part of the covenant? Or was the covenant a way of life of walking with God, and just an outward symbol of it was circumcision? Are you with me? All right. Baptism. Does someone go to heaven if they haven't been baptized?
Sure.
Are you sure? You're right. All right. So but because what's baptism? Outward sign of an inward grace. It's a symbol. Now, baptism is helpful, just like communion is helpful, and in the Catholic Church, the other 7 sacraments, they're very helpful because they are those external experiences, something physical that describes something that's taking place on the inside of the person. Are you with me? But they are symbols in and of themselves, even in the Catholic Church. All right? It's a higher place of symbolism, but they're still symbols. Symbol. But just because you have the symbol, but you violate everything that was supposed to lead to a different way of life, the symbolism doesn't mean a thing. That's what Paul is getting at here. And he said, actually, those who are not circumcised, they don't have the symbol, but yet they live this type of life. Well, actually, they are circumcised. Not physically, spiritually. Those who are physically circumcised, but they don't live the way of life, well, they're really not circumcised, even though physically they have been circumcised. That's what Paul is getting at here. So what he's done in this entire chapter is he's turned the cart over on any level of thought that says, well, I have received specific revelation, i.e. the Torah, and because I have received it, I'm not in the same boat as those who are outside of the covenant. Because what you have received now has become the jury, because you're now held accountable to what was required of you, and you were not obedient. All right? Does that make sense? Oh, we finished with a minute to spare. I told you this year I'm finishing the whole book. We're not leaving anything open-ended. All right, any comments, questions that show up just in this chapter? Let me make sure I haven't missed anything of any importance. Nope, we're all good. All right, so go in peace. May the Lord be with you.